The scream of wind woke her before the knock did. Ruth Calder sat up in the dark, blanket falling from her shoulders, heart slamming against her ribs. For one confused breath, she thought she was back in the farmhouse, back in the bed that was never really hers to keep. Then her hand found stone instead of wood, and she remembered where she was. Someone was pounding on the hide door. "Ruth," a man's voice, torn ragged by the storm. "Ruth, open up." She was on her feet before she finished waking, dragging the buffalo hide aside just enough to see him. Samuel Pike, half buried in snow, one arm locked around a woman who could barely stand. Behind them, the valley had disappeared into a churning wall of white. That was 5 months from now. Ruth didn't know that yet, standing in the wind with her arm around a stranger's shoulder. Right now, in the gray hour before this story truly begins, she was only a woman with a shovel and $32 sewn into a rag, walking north along a half-frozen creek with nowhere left to go. To understand why Samuel Pike would come pounding on her door in the worst storm of the decade, why the same man who once told her she was mad would later beg to be let inside, you have to go back to the morning nobody raised their voice. That was the part that stayed with her. Not shouting, just quiet. Her husband's brothers had stood around the kitchen table with their coffee going cold and told her, in the calm and reasonable tones men use when they've already decided something, that she couldn't stay. Their brother was in the ground. Her son had never drawn breath. The claim belonged to the Brennan name, and she wasn't a Brennan anymore. Not really, not without a child to prove it. Nobody called her wicked. Nobody called her a burden. One of them, the older one, had actually looked sorry when he said it. That was almost worse. She'd packed what was hers in under 10 minutes. A dented kettle, a bone-handled knife, a wool blanket gone thin at the corners, a shovel with a crack running halfway up the handle. $32, all the money she had in the world, tied in a cloth pouch against her ribs where no one could reach it without her knowing. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, she was already a mile north, listening to Ash Creek move beneath its skin of morning ice. Every soul in that valley understood the arithmetic of a Colorado winter. For walls, enough wood stacked and dry, a roof built to carry snow instead of collapsing under it. Miss any one of those, and the cold would find the gap and finish you slowly, the way it liked to. Ruth had none of it. What she had was a memory. 3 months back, gathering chokecherries along the south bank, she'd found a hollow cut into the sandstone face of the ridge. Not a cave exactly. More like the earth had started building something and given up halfway. She remembered standing inside it with her basket at her feet, running her hand along the dry stone, feeling something she couldn't name at the time. She could name it now. It had been a door closing somewhere far off, and her body knowing before her mind did. The alcove was exactly as she'd left it. A shallow mouth of stone facing south, high enough to stand in, deep enough to matter, tucked into a fold of the cliff that broke the worst of the north wind. Ruth set her bundle in the back corner, pressed her palm flat against the rock wall, and waited to see if it would give her any reason to doubt it. It didn't shift, didn't groan, didn't ask whose widow she was, or whether she'd earned the right to still be breathing. She stepped back out into the cold and started digging before the fear could catch up to her. The first day was nothing but dirt. She leveled the uneven floor with a shovel that fought her every foot of the way, until her shoulders burned and her palms split open at the base of each finger. By dusk, she had a flat platform and a low earthen ridge piled at the entrance. Ugly work, the kind that left mud under her nails for a week, but the kind that mattered. That night she slept in her boots with the blanket wound tight, and somewhere out past the ridge, coyotes traded calls in the dark. The stone at her back cut the wind in half. It wasn't warmth. It was something to build warmth on top of later. On the second day, she went to the creek for rock. She chose each piece with her hands before her eyes, turning it, weighing it, feeling for the flat plane that would sit true against its neighbor. Her grandmother had taught her this, back in the old country, in a language Ruth barely used anymore except in her head when she worked. Stone speaks if you listen before you cut. Most frontier folk never learned that. They built in wood because wood was fast, and fast was what desperate people reached for. Ruth wasn't in a hurry. She had nothing left to rush toward. By the third day, a wall was rising across the mouth of the alcove, stone fitted tight against stone with no mortar at all, just patience, and a refusal to leave any gap wide enough for the wind to find. That was when she heard the horse. Samuel Pike reined in near the creek path and sat there a long moment before he dismounted, staring at the half-built wall like it had personally offended him. He was a broad, weathered man who'd once surveyed rail lines before the valley claimed him, and he had the kind of voice that judged you whether he meant it to or not. "Tell me," he said, walking closer, "that you don't mean to live in this." Ruth didn't look up from the stone in her hands. "I mean to survive in it." He ducked under the low stone lip and looked around. The dirt floor, the crooked wall, the pile of rock waiting to become more wall. "This is a hole in a cliff, Mrs. Calder. It's shelter. You'll freeze. Not if I build it right." She fitted the stone into place and checked the seam with her thumb, the way she'd been taught. Rock holds cold. It also holds heat. Samuel made a short sound through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite not one. "This is Colorado. Not some stone village by the sea. Rock's still rock." Ruth finally met his eyes. "Wherever it sits." He said nothing for a moment. The wind dragged along the ridge above them, dry and low. He looked at her split hands, her cracked shovel, the chalk marks she'd started sketching near the back wall for where the heater would go. "No timber," he said. "No help. No proper tools. Then I'd better stop talking and keep working." He stood there another moment, like he was waiting for sense to come and rescue her from herself. It didn't. Eventually, he pulled his gloves back on, mounted up, and rode off shaking his head, a man certain he'd just watched someone choose her own grave. Ruth watched him go only long enough to be sure he was really gone. Then she picked up the next stone. The wall reached her chest by the second week of November. She'd cut a narrow doorway into the eastern side and left it open, working now with more care than force, learning which bands of sandstone gave easily and which ones held. A rib of harder stone ran along the back. She left that one alone entirely. Her grandmother's voice again, unbidden, "Take only what you trust, and leave the rest to hold the roof up." By mid-November, the chamber ran nearly 20 feet back into the cliff, wide enough to turn in without brushing a wall, high enough to stand straight, deep enough that the worst of the cold couldn't settle in all at once. At night, she lay under her blanket counting what still needed doing. A real door, storage, air, and heat. Heat above everything, because she'd seen what happened to families who built fires without thinking, who woke up dizzy under smoke that had nowhere to go. Fire could kill you just as fast as cold could, if you weren't careful where you built it. So in the back corner, she began shaping something better than an open flame. She hauled clay up from the creek bank, worked it with dried grass and water until it held like heavy dough, then packed it around a stone firebox with narrow channels cut through it, a shape designed to hold heat inside the mass long after the flames themselves had died. It wasn't pretty. Ruth had stopped caring what was pretty the morning her husband's brothers stood in that kitchen with their coffee. She was smoothing wet clay along the heater's side one gray afternoon when a shadow fell across the doorway. Lydia Mercer stood just outside, the rancher's daughter, wrapped in a dark coat with a fur collar, gloves far too fine for anything but standing still. She looked at the half-finished chamber the way a person looks at something they've been warned about. "Ruth." Her voice was careful. "People are talking. People always are. They say you mean to spend the winter here." Lydia stepped inside, nose wrinkling faintly at the smell of wet clay. "This is beneath you." Ruth sat back on her heels and wiped her wrist across her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt behind. "Cold doesn't care what's beneath me." Lydia hesitated. For a moment, she looked younger than she probably wanted to. "You could come stay with us. Father might find you room in the wash house until something can be arranged. Something in Ruth's face shifted just slightly. And what would be arranged? Lydia had no answer ready for that. The silence went on a while. Outside, wind slid along the cliff face with a low hiss, like it was listening too. A woman alone shouldn't live like this, Lydia said finally. A woman alone should live, Ruth answered. However she has to. Lydia's eyes moved over the tight-fitted stone, the carved shelves beginning to take shape in the sidewall, the berm packed at the entrance to turn drifting snow. Something in her expression changed, not quite respect yet, but the first crack in certainty. You really believe this will hold? Ruth stood and crossed to the doorway, pointing out the angle of the berm, the drainage line she'd cut, the way the cliff face would break the worst of the north wind before it ever reached the wall. It'll hold. And if you're wrong? Ruth looked out over the valley, where the light was already starting to fail. Then I'll die knowing I tried harder than anyone expected me to. Lydia's throat moved, but nothing came out. A few minutes later she left, picking her way down the frost-hardened slope in boots meant for a life that didn't include hard ground. The first blizzard came on the 21st of December, before sunrise, with a sound like the sky tearing loose from itself. Snow didn't fall. It drove sideways, hard enough to erase the world past the doorway. Ruth sealed the hide, fed the fire in careful measures, and sat listening to the storm try the cliff above her like it was testing for weakness. The cave didn't shake. That was the first thing she let herself believe. The second was the warmth. Small, steady, held inside the stone the way she'd built it to be. She slept in short pieces, waking each time to listen. Timbers groaning somewhere out in the dark. Once a heavy crack that might have been a roof giving up entirely. When the storm finally broke after a day and a half, the silence afterward felt almost wrong. Ruth lifted the hide and stared out at a valley remade in white. Snow lay waist-deep. Half her entrance had drifted over, but the berm had done exactly what she'd asked it to. The rest stood clear. Down the slope, Samuel Pike's shed leaned hard to one side. Lydia's porch rail had snapped clean under the ice. Smoke rose thin and struggling from chimneys that hadn't been built for a winter like this one. Ruth looked only long enough to understand what she was seeing. Then she went back inside, fed the heater one more careful load, and sat with her hands out to the warmth, knowing something the rest of the valley hadn't admitted to itself yet. This winter wasn't beginning. It had already declared what it meant to do. And 3 weeks later, in the dead middle of a second storm twice as vicious as the first, she would hear boots stumbling through the snow outside her door, Samuel's voice tearing against the wind, a child crying somewhere behind him, and a choice waiting on the other side of that hide curtain that would decide who she really was, once and for all. Ruth didn't wait for a second knock. She threw the hide aside and the wind came in like something with teeth. And there was Samuel with one arm locked around Lydia, and Lydia curled protectively over something small and crying. A child, face buried in her mother's shoulder, snow-crusted white in dark hair. Chimney came down. Samuel shouted over the roar. Smoke filled the whole house. We couldn't stay. Ruth didn't ask questions. She hauled them through one at a time, fast, before the wind could steal what little heat the chamber had built up, then dropped the hide back into place, and the world outside went silent and far away. For a moment nobody moved. Snow melted off 3 sets of boots on a packed earth. Lydia stood frozen in the middle of the chamber, still holding her daughter too tight, her eyes moving over the stone walls like she was trying to understand a language she'd never bothered to learn. It's warm, she said, and something in her voice made it sound almost like an accusation. Ruth was already moving. For bodies changed everything about how this space breathed. More moisture in the air, more risk if she didn't manage it right. She widened the vent, cut the fire back to something smaller and hotter, watched the smoke to see how it pulled. Samuel understood enough to stay out of her way. He sat near the entrance with his hands open toward the heat, saying nothing, his face hollowed out in a way Ruth hadn't seen on him before. Lydia sank down against the far wall with the girl. Emma, Ruth would learn later, curled into her lap and stared at nothing. Hours passed, then a full day. The wind rose and fell in vicious pulses, and once, deep in the second night, something gave way somewhere down the valley with a crack that traveled through the stone itself. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Emma finally slept, cheek pressed to her mother's arm. Samuel's eyes had gone distant with exhaustion. And Lydia kept looking at the shelves cut into stone, the heater's dull orange glow, the buffalo hide holding the whole storm outside like it was nothing at all. "They called you mad," she said finally, so quiet it was almost lost under the wind. Ruth kept her eyes on the firebox. Winter doesn't care what people call a thing. Lydia's gaze dropped. Something moved across her face, not quite shame, something closer to grief. "I was wrong about you." Ruth looked at her then, really looked, and saw past the fear and the cold to something harder to carry. The particular pain of judging someone by your own comfort, only to end up alive because of the very strength you'd mocked. "We were all just trying not to be afraid," Ruth said. "You weren't cruel. You were only certain. Those aren't the same thing, but they feel it from inside." Lydia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Something had already shifted, and both of them knew it. The storm burned itself out after 36 hours. When Ruth finally pulled the hide aside, the silence outside had a strange weight to it, like the valley itself was holding its breath. What waited beyond the drift barely looked like a settlement anymore. Barn roofs had folded in on themselves. Fence lines had vanished under snow deep enough to swallow a man to the waist. Farther down the valley, one ranch house had gone down entirely, walls and roof together, crushed flat by weight it was never built to hold. Samuel stood beside her, staring at what was left, his voice gone thin. "This wasn't foolishness. What you built here." Ruth said nothing. There was nothing left to prove, and she'd stopped needing to prove it days ago. Lydia and Emma stayed on until the chimney could be rebuilt and the smoke cleared from their walls. Samuel came and went, sleeping in the cave whenever the wind turned mean again, and the shelter Ruth had carved for one now quietly held for. Shifting, adjusting, the way she'd adjusted to every hard thing this winter had handed her. She raised the storage higher, cut new bedding hollows into the rear wall, watched the vent like it was the most important thing in the world, because for 4 people breathing in a stone room, it was. Survival, she'd learned, was never one great act. It was 100 small corrections, made quietly, before anything had the chance to fail. A few days later, Father Michael made the climb up from the valley floor, his chapel roof half gone, snow crusted thick on his coat. He stood by the heater a long moment, palm pressed flat against the warm stone, and let out a breath that seemed to carry more than just cold air. "So it held," he said. "Yes." He looked around the chamber, the shelves, the careful joints in the stone, the fire banked low and patient. "You trusted rock over timber." "I trusted what wouldn't bend," Ruth said. The priest was quiet for a while after that, watching her the way a man watches something he's only just understood the size of. "Then this valley has a great deal to learn," he said finally, "and I suspect you're the only one equipped to teach it." He wasn't wrong. By the last week of January, men who'd once ridden past laughing began climbing the slope with real questions instead. How deep had she cut before the temperature steadied? How had she known which stone to leave and which to take? How the vent managed to draw without choking the whole room in smoke? Ruth answered plainly, never more than the question asked for. She showed them the faint fracture lines running through the sandstone, the places where the rock wanted to split, and the places where it would hold if you respected it enough to listen first. She talked about frost depth, about air moving through mass, about patience as something you built with, not something you waded through. Lydia listened to all of it, every time, saying little. One evening, with Emma asleep under a folded blanket near the back wall, she finally said what had clearly been sitting in her for weeks. You built this because nobody gave you anywhere else to be. Ruth kept working a thin bead of clay into a hairline crack near the entrance, not looking up. I built it because winter was coming, and I intended to still be alive when it left. She smoothed the clay flat with her thumb. It just happens that now it shelters the same people who turned away from me. The rock doesn't keep score. I decided I wouldn't either. Lydia's throat worked, but for once she didn't try to answer that. By February, the worst of the storms had spent themselves, though the cold still held the valley in a tight grip. Small groups began walking the south-facing ridges, studying the rock the way Ruth had, looking for alcoves, for overhangs, for the kind of shelter that didn't ask you to gamble everything on a roof beam holding. Men who'd trusted only timber their whole lives started speaking about stone like it was something worth understanding. Women carried scraps of paper up the slope to write down whatever Ruth was willing to tell them. The woman sent away with a broken shovel and $32 sewn into a rag had become, without ever once asking for it, the quiet teacher of the whole valley. Late in March, once her own house had finally been repaired, Lydia climbed the slope alone. The creek ran louder now, swollen with melt, and the air had turned, not warm yet, but changed, carrying something underneath the cold that hadn't been there in months. You could come back to town, Lydia said. You've more than proven yourself. Nobody would say a word against you now. Ruth looked around the chamber, the walls smoothed by her own hands, the shelves, the sleeping hollows, the heater still holding its quiet warmth in the corner. Every mark in that stone was hers. This place had taken her in when no person would, and it had kept her alive long enough for the valley to finally see her clearly. This is my home, she said. Not a decision, just a fact, settled somewhere past arguing. Lydia studied her for a long moment. You feel no bitterness toward any of them? Ruth's head moved, the faintest shake. Bitterness wastes heat. She almost smiled. I learned that from the fire. Everything else, I learned the same way. By April, grass pushed up green through the last of the thaw. Children's laughter carried up from the creek again. Roofs across the valley had been rebuilt, some in wood, but more than a few now backed against stone, set low against south-facing rock the way Ruth had shown them. One warm afternoon, a widower named Caleb Turner climbed the slope with a small burlap sack in his hands. He stood outside the entrance a while before Ruth noticed him, turning his hat in his fingers, saying nothing until she stepped into the light. For the ground below your cave, he said finally, holding the sack out. Apple seeds. South-facing slope like this, they might take. Ruth took the sack and felt the small, dry weight of it in her palm. Seeds. Something patient. Something meant for a season neither of them could see yet from here. They walked down together to the soft ground beneath the sandstone face and pressed the seeds into the earth side by side, saying little, needing to say less than that. When they finished, Ruth stood with dirt under her nails and sun warming the cliff at her back, and understood something she hadn't let herself believe all winter. She hadn't beaten the cold. She hadn't bent it or outlasted it through sheer stubbornness alone. She had simply understood it better than the people who'd cast her out, listened where they assumed, built where they doubted. And when the storms finally came hard enough to humble the entire valley, the shelter she'd shaped out of grief and stone and $32 had become something none of them expected. Not a last resort. A beginning. The creek moved bright in the spring light below the ridge. The cliff held the day's warmth against her back, the way it always had, the way it always would. Behind her, the cave stood in calm, steady silence, no longer the only thing standing between her and the cold, but simply home.